Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have a very special guest with me today, Mr. Doug Ferguson. Doug is the chairman of KPMG New South Wales, and he's also the chairman of Asia Society. Welcome, Doug. Thank you very much for joining us today. Normally what we do is just talk about you first and ask you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about yourself. I'd like you to also expand that on your role as chairman of KPMG, and in particular your role as Asia Society.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you, Dipen, for having us. So I'm, as you said, chairman of KPMG in New South Wales. New South Wales is our biggest state, accounts for about 45% of the firm's overall revenues, and we've got 5 offices here and nearly 4,000 staff. And what's interesting is we've actually got a lot of Indian staff members that have joined us out of universities and are coming through from graduate level to very senior levels.
Wow.
In addition to that, I also have been the leader of our Asia and international client business in Australia for the last 5 or 6 years, and that really is where my interest in India really connects. So we've got an India practice that's dedicated to serving Indian clients that are in Australia, and also taking Australian clients that are interested in investing and trading to India, which we do a lot of. So it's a business that's very strategically important for us, run by Jay Patel, and I guess it sort of covers trade, investment, and also the big picture government support and geopolitical assessments and those sorts of things for our clients.
Fantastic. A little bit about Asia Society and your role there, and what sort of work you do with Asia Society.
Yeah, well, the Asia Society is it's my nighttime job, I suppose. It's a great passion of mine.
Yeah.
The Asia Society's been established in Australia for 22 years now. It was founded by the Honourable John Howard, and we've had some incredible chairs: Hugh Morgan, Warwick Smith, and now myself. We've got a broad mandate to help build bridges between Australian companies and universities and entities in Australia with Asia. So we're Pan-Asian focus. We're connected into the Asia Society global footprint, which is 14 centres around the world, headquartered in Hong Kong and in New York. So the Asia Society, we do probably about 45 events per year, mainly in Sydney and Melbourne.
Right.
And we also do quite a lot of thought leadership. On the India side of things, we've recently hosted the High Commissioner Harinder Sidhu as the guest speaker at our Hawker Ball in Melbourne, which was to launch our Melbourne Centre. But we've also previously hosted roundtables for the Indian High Commissioner, Dr. Gondane here, and also for the for various other Australian High Commissioners in India when they're back in Australia. So very big focus on India for the Asia Society as well.
And last year, the Australian government commissioned a report which was authored by Peter Varghese on the India economic strategy. And I know that KPMG had an input in that.
Yeah.
It covers 10 industry sectors, and they're prioritised from education downward, and then 10 states. What are your thoughts on where the report is at the moment and where it will take Australian businesses? Predominantly it's for Australian businesses to understand India and the opportunities in India. So what are your thoughts in as far as where that report is currently and where it will take Australian businesses going forward?
Well, I think the report's excellent, and Peter Varghese and his team should be credited for really shining the light on the exciting opportunities for Australian companies in India, and it's very specific, and it gives corporate leaders in Australia the opportunity to really go to their sector and then look at where's best place to enter and how to enter. Yes. What I can say is that in the India-Australia relationship, I think government is leading and business is trailing in terms of trade and investment. So I think we've never seen a better government-to-government relationship between successive Australian Prime Ministers and your Prime Minister Modi. I think it's very strong, and the fact that Prime Minister Morrison's going in January is a really important sign of where we sit as two countries that have had differences in the past that are moving towards very deep relationship across not only business but also, I think, security and regional cooperation. So I think where we're at with the business side of things is Australian companies have been traditionally very domestically focused, or North America and Europe. China has emerged as a big thing over the last 10 or 15 years,
Yes.
but there is no doubt that India is the next big thing for Australian companies. No other market offers the scale or the diversity of opportunities that India offers. But I think Australian companies will need to do more trips over there, perhaps on business delegations like the AIBX coming up in February,
Yes.
to really see with their own eyes, to overcome perceptions that are actually misperceptions in many ways, because under the Indian government, a lot of progress has been made around reform.
You've spent some time in China, so you know how Australian businesses deal with China and how China works. And you've just made some comments on the India side as well. And you're now starting to see India as an opportunity for Australian businesses. And all too often we're finding that the perception and maybe previous experiences have left Australian businesses a little bit shy of India. What can be done by organizations such as Asia Society, or such as the AIBC, or such as the Australia India Institute, or the Australia India Council, or even state governments, the federal governments, to alleviate some of the issues that Australian businesses have, to take them into India, apart from just going to delegations? What are some of the things that can be done? Even KPMG, for example, you've got offices in India. How can you encourage, or what can you do for Australian businesses to make them feel that, look, India's changed, there's a lot of different policy changes that have happened, and that you need to go back in and have a look?
Well, I think there's no substitute for data-based research and case studies. So I think that there's examples that and great stories that need to be told, and the Asia Society and KPMG are doing our level best to produce insights that are also very supportive of economic growth in the relationship. The key thing, and what I learned out of China, was you've got to have a strong Indian partner. So the people-to-people connectivity is very important. I know the Indian government has been putting a disproportionate amount of effort to bring delegations out here to run and try to introduce the right sort of partners to Australian companies. But that's, you can't go, I don't think you should go into India without any experience, without a strong local Indian partner. So it's the finding of the middle ground in these joint ventures and partnerships. And I don't think it's going to be the traditional sectors just around mining and ICT and education. I think it's going to be in agri-tech. I think it's going to be in health tech, in new forms of education around vocational training, where Australia's got really strong expertise, financial services in certain areas as well, matched with the Indian requirements to scale and broaden out into a successful Indian adaptive model. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I think that the narrative has to change from the Australian perspective, and we need to look at new models. Financial services, you mentioned, is a strong area. One of the things that the Indian government and Indian businesses have tried very hard is to attract Australian super funds to come and invest in India. We've slowly started. You can see a little bit of a movement there with Australian Super and now the commitment from the Future Fund. How can we expedite that from your perspective? I mean, you're sitting at this level where you're assisting some major Australian businesses and talking to them about expansion and growth and opportunities. What are some of the things that you're saying to attract them into India? How can we make that faster?
Well, for starters, the Australian superannuation industry just continues to grow in terms of assets under management, and all super funds now that are large and potentially merging with each other need to allocate funding out globally.
Right.
So it's never going to be a disproportionate weighting towards India or China or Indonesia, but there is going to be more just by the sheer fact that the pool is growing and that there's a need. And you've pointed to Aussie Super's investment in the NAAF. I think this upcoming trip of Prime Minister Morrison with the delegation that's being put together around that, I suspect will be heavily weighted towards financial services and superannuation, because these leaders need to go over there with their own eyes and look at the projects and understand the scale and the opportunity to continue to invest large sums of money for long periods of time in a market that is hugely democratic and increasingly well regulated. That will then enable the Indian government to recycle and reinvest into new infrastructure. So it becomes a partnership over many decades, hopefully, where the super funds invest. But I don't think there's any substitute for having specific projects ready to profile with the Australian super funds and getting them over with the most senior government leaders to have private discussions and look for opportunities.
Fantastic. But, we know that Macquarie Bank is already there, and they've invested heavily into some of the infrastructure projects. So they've had some experience, and they've stayed there for a long time. And Canadian companies like Brookfield have gone in a big way. So I think that blends well for some of the issues that may sort of arise for Australian super funds in regards to security, return of investments, transparency, governance, etc., etc.
I also think, Dipen, that the international examples need to be told as well. So when you've got the North American, the Canadians, and the Scandinavian pension funds all putting money into to India, it becomes a very compelling proposition as to, if not, why not, for Australian funds as well.
At one stage, when I read the India economic strategy, there was a comment on there, or a quote or a figure that was put in by Peter and the government, which said that Australia will invest up to $100 billion by 2035. I thought, before these first two investments were made, I thought it was pretty tough call. But now, having seen the momentum and what India has done to welcome international investments and breaking down the doors of foreign direct investment, particularly, for example, in mining and rail and defence and so on, with 100% FDI, I think there's a lot more opportunities. And also they've introduced Invest India, which is an organisation just specifically catering to handhold businesses that want to enter India. Like you suggested, a joint venture, for example, is vital in some cases, and Invest India can do so. So I think the Indian government have really listened to international comments and thoughts and views, and started to open up the doors in that way. You talked about the Australia-India Business Exchange that's happening next year. Are you KPMG participating, and what are some of the things that are happening in the Australia-India Business Exchange from the government perspective to encourage Australian businesses to go to India in February 2020?
Well, we're certainly participating. We're going to be there in India pretty much from the Prime Minister's delegation, which coincides with the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, which we're a very proud supporter of at KPMG. We'll then stay through until the India Business Exchange, which is about a month, which gives us time in between to go and see all of our valued clients, both on the Indian side and the Australian side, and to prepare well for a very important meeting in February at the AIBX. I think we're working with Austrade and others to understand the full range of opportunities, but I see this as a really big thing. We've actually not had something like this in Asia for a number of years, so we haven't had the big trips that we used to have to China or Indonesia for a number of times, and it's quite telling that this one's been organised for India. And fortunately, it's in February rather than mid-January, which is right in the middle of our holidays and cricket season. But I think there'll be a really good response rate from the Australian leaders across all sectors. And it's not just trade and pure sort of cross-border investment. There's a lot of Australian banks, funds managers, insurance companies, telecommunications companies that look to India for strategic solutions around their administration, their back office, their technology solutions. So there's this invisible sort of economy that's very important between Australia and India, and it's been very well established for a long time. That said, India isn't the only market. You know, you on the weekend I had to call Virgin and for something with my tickets, and we went onto a Philippine solution centre. So India is competing with the Philippines, with China and other markets around the region for this, but they've been at it for a very long time, and the Indian ICT companies and the major tech players and KPMG in this area as well as an emerging force have a distinctive advantage and a cost base that's very difficult to match.
Yes, I can imagine. And that's really interesting you say that, because there is an invisible sort of relationship between the two countries, which hasn't really been spoken about often. In fact, in the early days it was taken as a bit of a negative. But today you can see that the impact of the services, the back-end services that India offer, allows the Australian businesses to focus on their core business, which is a benefit and which actually employs a lot more Australians in that core business as opposed to the back end. I believe that needs to be more stories told on that, because these are positive stories. All too often, and we've spoken about this before, where we see Australia as a transactional country. We want to sell our commodities, and that's it at a certain level. And I think India needs to be different, handled differently, because of the cultures, different personalities, and so on. And that transactional mentality has to go. And I think what's happening now, like you said, there's a massive momentum at the moment with the Prime Minister going, with the Australian Business Exchange, and with masses of businesses taking interest, and organisations like Austrade and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are doing a tremendous amount of work on the ground. For Australian businesses to look at India, where do you see this relationship in the next 12 months, next 5 years, the next 15 years, and up to 2035, which is what the report is sort of...
For any market that's a real priority and that's turned to become very successful for Australia, it's underwritten by a bilateral free trade agreement or a closer economic partnership agreement. So I can completely understand that India perhaps wasn't ready for the regional comprehensive economic partnership, and good on them for taking their time to be very thoughtful and deliberate about what's in their best interests. But in the outcome of that, and that might continue to progress, there is and there should be a bilateral agreement between Australia and India that would underwrite confidence, that would underwrite a lot of the narrative and the rhetoric that comes out of both the India engagement strategy and also the upcoming Australian engagement strategy from the Indian side. So I think if we could have a dream scenario coming out of Prime Minister Morrison's trip to India is a commitment to revisit this and fast track an agreement between our countries.
I totally agree. I think it couldn't be anything better for the two countries to have a form of a CECA or a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement. I know there are some issues in certain sectors, but if they were to overlook that, I think that would be great. That being said, the Australia-India relationship has had this sort of roller coaster ride. It's been up and down. It's been climbing, but very slowly. But it stops and starts depending on the relationship between the prime ministers and where the countries are. Today, we talk about a movement and a momentum that's happening. I feel, and you might agree or disagree, that this is happening because there's a bigger geopolitical movement happening globally. What are your thoughts in that geopolitical movement, and why do you think that it's going in this direction, where Australia and India, are now coming together as two forces with so many complementarities that they couldn't do it before. But now there's some global forces that are coming together geopolitically that are making it happen, which I think is very positive. But why do you think that's happening today?
Well, the world has changed very dramatically in the last 5 years, but fortunately Australia and India have been on a very positive and constructive trajectory for that time as well. So there's been a natural meeting of the minds through a lot of effort by both sides. But there is no doubt that in our region, we used to talk about Asia. Now we talk about Indo-Pacific. There's now an understanding and a recognition that Australia needs to continue to invest in building its quadrilateral relationship with Japan and India and South Korea and other countries that are and the United States that are very like-minded, values-based countries. At the same time, we continue to engage, obviously, with China very constructively. China is an incredibly important strategic partner economically and also strategically, and there's a lot of goodwill between China and Australia. But I think that is, as you say, driving some of this urgency. We definitely, as a group of corporate leaders in Australia, we want to have a broad range of markets, and we also want to participate in the Indian demographic story. So China has lifted 700 or 800 million people out of abject poverty, and we would like to think that India and this current leadership that's just been re-elected has a very strong mandate to do similar things in India, but with a different structure in place. And so Australia's, there's an enormous amount of goodwill. We've had long educational links. We know each other well. We've trained some of these Indian leaders. They come back and forth regularly here. There's a lot of Indian investment, especially at the SME level here. So we feel very comfortable, I think, between countries with India. And that wasn't always the case. But now I think more than ever, it's a very strong and warm relationship. And what we need to do is to get the broader institutional investor community on board with this as well. We need to see Australian corporate leaders, with the support of their boards, making the right steps to enter and participate in the Indian market and explain their strategy and their story, both good and learning points with their institutional investors, so they can understand that this is going to be a very important source of growth for the next 10 or 15 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about what the Australian government can do and what the Australian businesses should be doing and where the perception issue is. As an Australian and an Australian corporate leader, what would you like to see the Indian companies and the Indian government do to match what we want the Australian businesses to do as well?
Well, I think the Indian companies do a great job internationally. So I'd like for us to understand more about what Indian companies are doing in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in the United States, in similar markets to Australia, so we can understand the scale. So most people don't understand the scale of the Tata Group.
Right. Yes.
And most people are using Tata products or driving Tata vehicles any day of the week, but they just don't know. So Indian companies like TCS and the Tata Group are doing a great job of educating Australian corporate and consumer markets around the quality of their products and the leading edge technology of their products. We'd also like to see greater levels of success of Australian companies in India. So we have, I think, bought into the Modi reform program, and we'd love to see more examples of, they don't have to be huge successes, but great progress being made, leading to growth, leading to great sort of community engagement, helping each other beyond just making a buck. And I think that this is the role that the Asia Society, that KPMG, that the organisations that we jointly all lead need to do, is to be able to tell stories and promote good examples, and also address issues that are real. Okay,
Yes.
don't continue to just put them aside as one-offs. If there's non-tariff issues or there's issues around regulatory red tape,
Yeah.
let's have those frank dialogues with the Indian counterparts, and let's try to get them at least understood better, as there might be very valid reasons for why there are delays in licensing or labelling issues or distribution issues through port. But let's understand why, so we can adapt, and there's also a representation made that we'd like to see this continue to improve as well, as Indian companies do in Australia. They are a very vocal lot,
Yeah.
and they stand up
Yeah.
for themselves, and we'd like to see Australia have the same sort of impact in India.
Yeah, and I think that's really a valid point, because all too often it's considered too hard. Let's open it up. Let's have a dialogue. Let's have a conversation, because things have changed so drastically in India, particularly over the last 5-6 years, with archaic laws being taken out of the system, the ease of doing business, the ability to network with clients, the hand-holding that the government does, the opening up of different industry sectors. So I think Australian companies who have been shy in the past need to see this, and I'm glad you made those comments, because those are on-the-ground comments. These are things that are real, that are happening, and I think that it needs to be opened up. So while you were talking, one thing came to mind, like Lindsay Fox, for example, has had a business in India for almost 10 years.
Yep.
It was only in year 9 that he started to turn a profit. And I've met with him a couple of times, and he said, Dipen, we had to go through lots of different things, and in order to understand India, before GST was introduced, you had to pay duties at his trucks had to pay duties at every point when you were crossing state borders. That was an issue, because it was an additional cost that they didn't take into consideration. And then they got away from the transport, and they got into logistics and warehousing, and they got these Indian people, and they gave them uniforms. They were so proud to wear the uniforms culturally, and then they gave them, from a work safety perspective, they gave them steel cap boots so they wouldn't hurt themselves. But because they were so proud of the boots and they kept them, they left them in the drawers, in the cupboards, in the locker rooms, and just wear their flip-flops, right?
Okay.
So these are the cultural things
Yeah.
that an Australian company actually had to understand, be there, and live through it, and then educate and understand, which is something that is really essential. And I'm really, sort of really happy that an organisation like Lynn Fox actually persevered and now has turned a profit and has continued to, flourish in India. So that story hasn't been told. That hasn't been communicated. And there are many, many stories like that. And I think you're right. I think we need to do something about that. And I think maybe Austrade can do something about that, or maybe DFAT or another organisation.
We all can. We've all got networks.
Yeah.
We can all tell stories.
Yeah.
What we don't want is a continuation of negative stories.
Yes.
Because in a market that's quite nervous, with institutional investors that are looking for dividend income, more and more, we need to ensure that there is an understanding around the strategic long-term investment and trade relationship with India. So I'd like to think that we will get there by necessity. We definitely need to not hedge, but we need to broaden our markets very quickly in Australia.
That brings me to another point. I've generally found the Australian institutional investors to be very conservative. How do we change their mentality to taking a little bit of their risk component, not all of it, just a tiny bit, into making them feel comfortable about putting some investments into a country like India?
Well, I wouldn't say that they are conservative. I would say that they need to believe in the strategy.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So when a CEO and a chairman come up with a material India strategy, it needs to be aligned to core business interests, whether it's increasing profitability or expanding into new markets or finding a technological joint venture partner. And that needs to be a very well developed strategy with some milestones for reflection and assessment, and also a very clear strategy of when to invest and how much to scale up based on those things. So I think, again, the onus is on the corporate leaders to develop the right strategy that's fundamental to their long-term corporate interests. And then I think institutional investors, as long as there's not a bet the farm sort of a strategy taken, and as long as they're comfortable that the Australian company with the right advisors have a grip on the cultural and the regulatory operating environment in that country, and they understand how capital can be repatriated and profits and taxes are paid, etc. I think institutional investors will be supportive. I think they understand that the Australian market is increasingly saturated, and we need new growth.
Yeah.
So where's that growth going to come from? There's no substitute for going where the biggest markets are in a still a fairly early stage of development. But as long as the strategy is sensible and it's sort of gradual, then I think it'll be okay.
Wonderful. On that note, Doug, thank you so much for spending some time with us and having a conversation. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Dipen.
Appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.